In terms of what you've got and in terms of capabilities to log and process a lot of these events, is that typically you would have, for example, log analytics workspace is typically a lot of times organizations will use, where they'll pipe kind of the logs from, let's say, Entra, so diagnostic settings will be configured, and then that will grab all the logs and then send them off to a log analytics workspace, similar to various kind of individual resources, etc. And then in that log analytics workspace, you've got that will populate the various tables based on the logs that you're piping over to it. And then you can do all sorts of like advanced queries on that to try and flag suspicious activities.
If you come from an on-premise AWS or GCP background, you probably have very little idea about Azure security. And even if you are in Azure security, you probably don't know what are the common ways attackers remain stealthy inside your Azure subscription. I had a conversation with Christian Philipov from WithSecure, where he spoke about the 3 common ways attackers have been using to remain stealthy inside your Azure subscription and tenants without being detected, using things technically Microsoft calls as features. Yes, you heard me. Now, we go into a bit more detail about what these methods are and what can you do, especially if you come from a non-Azure background, to understand perhaps it's an M&A and now you have to look after Azure security as well, or you are just starting to figure out what are some of the things you should look out for in Azure for doing security if you are starting today. Now, overall, it was a great conversation. If you know someone who is trying to work on Azure security, either on their organization or perhaps who's just trying to understand it a bit better and comes from a different cloud or on-premise background, this episode is definitely for them. And as always, if you have been listening or watching Cloud Security Podcast episodes for a while, and if you've been finding them valuable, I would really appreciate if you could drop us a follow, subscribe on audio and video platforms, whether you're watching this on YouTube or LinkedIn or listening to this on Apple or Spotify. It really means a lot when you subscribe and follow us. That helps us to know that we're doing the right thing as well. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Cloud Security Podcast. This is the Finnish version with a person from Manchester to make it more interesting. Man, thank you for coming to the show. Could you share a bit about yourself, your professional journey, man?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm one of our principal security consultants here at WithSecure. So I'm Christian Philipov. I deal with a lot of our cloud work within the team, specifically focus on Azure and GCP, but do a bit of AWS and whatever kind of comes through the door, really. And yeah, heading up like our specialist services internally is my role at the moment. But overall, yeah, still very much focused on cloud and still my main kind of focus area.
Awesome. And I guess the topic today is more around the Azure security and how to be stealthy in Azure. Can you give a gist of, I guess maybe before we dive into the services that you discovered, how would you classify stealthy? Because people know what happens in on-premise. What does that mean from a stealthy perspective? Am I getting domain admin? What am I getting? In the context of Azure, what is considered quote-unquote stealthy?
That's a very good question. So I guess the fundamental difference here to looking at cloud versus on-premise detection is the fact that for on-premise systems, we've had a lot of years to realistically develop defensive techniques and also ways of collecting relevant telemetry from systems that we use to then try and flag kind of suspicious activities.
Yep.
Like one really good example that may be a bit overused is, for example, Mimikatz running on some sort of box within your system. That's on practically 10 out of 10 times will be something suspicious and worth investigating.
Yeah.
In contrast, obviously cloud is relatively immature in comparison to just more traditional on-premise systems. And so in that sense, cloud detection engineering for like suspicious activities is also something that I think is getting into a very good stage now, but it's still growing kind of development. In this case, in Azure, specifically the stealthy part comes from a bit of a limitation that has existed within the platform and Entra, which is with specifically to read events. So like enumeration activities, reconnaissance, that sort of things.
Right.
These have been challenging because typically there wasn't really a good way to log these sorts of events. Like fundamentally don't exist in the telemetry that gets produced by Azure/Entra.
Yeah.
In contrast, obviously AWS has Cloudtrail, has a lot of these, like even just read-only events that are available there.
That's
so
right.
You can perform detections based on it, but just Azure did not have them up until recently. So,
still working towards it.
No, Microsoft's definitely put in a lot of work to try and cover this gap, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Okay, and the services that you discovered which helped you become stealthy in an Azure context, which one are they and why are they, I guess, important?
Yeah, so a bit of a background to people on it is that the Microsoft, like a lot of the Azure stuff, fundamentally has a control plane called Graph, under the hood that underpins a lot how the platform operates from an identity and access management perspective. So in the past, you've had Azure AD Graph, which was the more older version that kind of underpinned that whole thing. And then a new one, which is Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is the new one that now has the capability to, for example, log read events that happen against the tenant, which is great. That's exactly what we want.
Yeah.
Azure AD Graph, the older one, does not have that, for example. So that's why any interactions that have been done with Azure AD Graph just won't really get logged from an enumeration read-only perspective. And then additionally, you've got a few other APIs, because this is the truth of like looking under the hood a bit on Azure and Entra, is that it's made of a lot of different APIs.
Right.
Partially because of like purchases and mergers done for Microsoft to build up the Azure platform, obviously partially depending on kind of the development culture of like how to get different APIs to interact with each other within it. But overall, you've got stuff like the Ibiza API, that is the topic of the conversation that discussed for CloudSec and now at Disobey. And also you've got stuff like the PIM API, for example. Like all these are just disparate APIs, and the notion is that a lot of them don't necessarily log that sort of read enumeration because they don't use Microsoft Graph under the hood, and they are their own thing. And so it really depends on whether or not their own thing has been implemented to provide that telemetry for customers to actually consume and process.
Interesting. And sorry, could you elaborate a bit more on Ibiza and PIM? What are they?
Yeah, so these are the lesser known APIs under the hood that are used by Azure. So the Ibiza API, as much as it sounds pretty cool,
I was going to say it's like a part,
it's not the holiday destination, but it's an API that's basically made for the main kind of portal. For example, the web console that you would use to interact with Azure via just a web browser. So it's used by that to interact with some of the stuff within Microsoft Graph, as well as the Azure Resource Manager API. So it's, I guess the best comparison is a sort of a middleware kind of component to allow the portal to do all these things and interact with the broader APIs in a more extensible manner.
Right.
And then the PIM API is its own thing, primarily because privileged identity management was its own service, then integrated into Entra to underpin and control just-in-time access to various roles. And like overall, it doesn't integrate as natively with Graph just because it is its own thing that was linked into it. That's why it also, like activities that happen there don't necessarily get logged to Microsoft Graph in the same way.
Interesting. And because the PIM service is an interesting one from a, I guess, plus I think it has you require the E5 license for it or E7, whatever the license requirement is.
So PIM requires the Entra P2 licenses, for example, to use. So it is an additional cost to be added to
That's right.
your kind of management.
Because not many people, I guess maybe most of the enterprises may be using it, but it may not be as wide. But the Ibiza one is probably much more wider.
Yeah, the Ibiza one is just fundamentally there, whether you have the license or not, as long as you're using Azure. Kind of under the hood, the portal will be using some calls to the Ibiza API. And so it is available to people just as long as you're just using Azure.
Interesting. And I guess, so if it's not being recorded, it feels a bit more, oh wait, does that mean there is no detection that is possible? Or is that more, I guess it makes me a bit nervous at the fact that is there no detection possible? Yeah,
so that's a very good question. And to clarify, it does sound bad, but it's not that bad realistically. Because the detection issues we have is for kind of read events specifically. So for example, let's say me getting a list of users in the tenant or getting a list of groups, etc. Like state changing action. So for example, if I manage to compromise a high privileged user and try to perform some changes within the environment, those will still get logged. Because even in the old graph, state-changing activities have always been logged. It's been primarily the gap has always been in the enumeration, kind of initial access recon stages.
Like the read-only thing that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So it does sound bad in the sense that like these sorts of events, there isn't a good way to detect purely based on that, similar to what you might want and have in AWS, for example, with CloudTrail. But in a more practical sense of trying to detect active attacks against your environment, you can still very much figure out like a lot of the events that happen around that attack. So for example, telemetry that gets generated when a user has an additional MFA factor added, or telemetry that gets generated when a user tries to add another secret to a service principal. Like all these things, because they're state changing, will still get logged, and so you do still have opportunities to get these elements out the door.
Yeah, and would you say now that you're able to, I guess you're able to record a state change, but Is it hard? Because I imagine I could just be a normal user trying to figure out, hey, how many users do we have? Which a lot of cloud security engineers would do as a normal activity.
Yeah.
But that's not being recorded to what you're saying as well in Azure, because it's not a state change. It's just I'm trying to find out, hey, if there are a list of users, who are they? Who's my domain admin? In terms of, I guess, what's a takeover example? Just to draw a parallel from, say, on-premise people normally try and go for hey, I want to get domain admin. And I guess where I'm going with this is that if there is no detection for read actions, but a state change has a quote-unquote logs history, how does detection work in Azure for state changes? And is that Sentinel, or what's the path that people choose to do detection? Because I think CSPM is another path people can take. What are some of the options for them if they want to go down that path? And can this be mitigated? Because it sounds like a behavior thing. Doesn't sound like hey, I'm doing a blob storage open to the internet kind of a thing.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So overall, like in terms of what you've got and in terms of capabilities to log and process a lot of these events, is that typically you would have, for example, log analytics workspace is typically a lot of times organizations will use, where they'll pipe kind of the logs from, let's say, Entra. So diagnostic settings will be configured, and then that will grab all the logs and then send them off to a log analytics workspace, similar to various kind of individual resources, etc. And then in that log analytics workspace, you've got that will populate the various tables based on the logs that you're piping over to it. And then you can do all sorts of like advanced queries on that to try and flag suspicious activities. That's typically the way a lot of organizations do it. You can use Sentinel specifically as well, more as a SIEM sort of solution. It effectively uses a log analytics workspace under the hood to it. It's just optimized for security operations and raising alerts based on kind of behavior analytics done by Microsoft under the hood for a lot of these things. But that's definitely an option. Or you can obviously pipe them onto whatever third-party product that you're using as well. So like, for example, Splunk, obviously a very common one for people in security teams to then get the logs into.
Yeah.
And that's typically how a lot of times, like from an organizational perspective, more bigger enterprises, that's the different ways that we see people go about it.
Yep.
Obviously, you've got the CSPM angle, so you can use in the context of Azure specifically if you want to flag potentially suspicious events there, or resources that might have been like exposed. So for example, a storage blob has been now publicly exposed. You can use either the native CSPM if like people that are deep into the Microsoft ecosystem often end up using Defender for Cloud, or they can use obviously a third-party one. But ultimately, a lot of the logs similarly will get piped from like diagnostic settings, etc., configured to then send over a lot of that telemetry to the CSPM alongside with active access to the resources, and then flag stuff accordingly based on that.
And where does Microsoft Defender fit in? Because I think I'm glad you kind of mentioned it, because a lot of people assume that, I don't need any extra playbook on my Sentinel because I have Microsoft Defender looking at all of that. How is Microsoft Defender in the Azure landscape? I know it does a great job on the other side of Office 365, SharePoint, all of that as well. On the Azure landscape, how is Defender in cloud in terms of how is it used? What is it? Because people may not even know what that is. What is it, and what's the superpower that it has that makes people use it?
It's an excellent question. So Defender for Cloud, it doesn't help that obviously there are a lot of products in the Defender for X suite. And so it does make it a bit difficult to figure out what encompasses what. Defender for Cloud is a broader term for a lot of other kind of sub-services within it. Like there are Defender for Resource Manager. There is Defender for storage account.
Individually, each one of them?
Yeah, no, they are technically individual components that are part of Defender for Cloud effectively, which is where the complication comes from. Because obviously you've got these individual components to it that you can enable, disable accordingly, just because each of them price differently based on resources, based on number of requests, etc., etc. So ultimately Microsoft gives you a chance to enable and disable whichever ones you care about, and then obviously scope it up, scope it down, depending on what exactly you want to focus on. But fundamentally, to answer your original question, where I think the strength of it lies, is that obviously given that it's a lot of, especially if you're using the Microsoft ecosystem a lot, it does make sense to keep using some of those because they do interact nicely and integrate nicely within each other from a behavior analytics perspective. And so the more of this suite that you use, like technically Microsoft, the implication is there that but then it provides a lot more telemetry for Sentinel and the various kind of Defender products to be able to do a lot of these behavior analytics and kind of machine learning that they do behind the scenes to flag kind of suspicious events for your environment. Obviously, from a more practical perspective, it varies from company to company how much value that they will get out of it.
Yeah.
It's a difficult one, and I'm sure you're well familiar of, like, obviously you've got features versus costs, and so it's a difficult like equation to go in balance. But ultimately, I guess that's the strength of it, is that it integrates nicely with a lot of native services. For example, containers. If you care about that, you might then be interested in using the Defender for kind of containers equivalent solution there. Or if you got a lot of sensitive material stored in databases, you can look at enabling that. And then it has the capability to flag kind of suspicious events happening with those individual resources.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the Azure space is just knowing the number of services that are relevant. I think as you mentioned storage, I'm the first thing like, oh yeah, where does Purview fit into this? I'm like, oh, that's another kind of one. I'm like, I'm not going to open it. But with the Defender in cloud, the behavior that we just spoke about from a read-only perspective, I don't think it has the whole behavior analysis from that perspective. Does it? Can Defender in cloud do the behavior analysis to say, hey, Christian seems to be doing a lot of read action, but Ashish on the other end seems to be just doing way too many API calls?
Yeah, no, it's a difficult one because I don't believe it has that level of like granularity.
Because that would make it like the level of any, like a popular theme. Because I don't hear a Defender for cloud as a really popular, hey, like a user behavior analytic kind of a thing. So I imagine it's not there.
No, so a lot of the user behavior stuff is focused very much on kind of the platform level stuff within the Entra tenant itself. So a lot of the, for example, it does have like behavior analytics for kind of the way you approach sign-ins, where you do the sign-ins, at what point do you do sign-ins, etc. So for example, a lot of the, like a common example is obviously if you log in primarily from, let's say, London, because you're based in London, etc. And then at some point you log in randomly from an IP that's based
in Finland.
Yeah, or even like just some other part of, some part of the UK. It can then figure out, oh, this is a bit suspicious. Depending on the distance, depending on how diverse it is, it will flag it at different kind of levels.
Yeah.
But that's mostly where the behavior analytics is focused on, is the tenant and like user sign-in, user kind of basic usage sort of stuff, which is still very important because it does capture and can capture a lot of like just overtly suspicious stuff. Like obviously you can try to be significantly stealthier. You can still use like a different IP from based in London, so that might not necessarily trip a lot of wires in the same way.
Yeah.
But then obviously if you got a proper actual security team looking at it, they'll be like, oh, that's weird. She's logged in from a slightly different IP this one time.
Yeah.
Just completely out of the box. And then an hour later he just logged on from his normal one. So maybe it would.
Because we've been talking about detection.
Yeah.
Is there like a prevention that we can apply it over here? I guess I'm obviously focusing much more on the stealthier side, because I think, actually maybe before we go on to the prevention, many people just don't have one subscription with Azure. They probably have a lot, probably multiple tenants as well. And how does this were you able to scale it out across a larger environment, or were people who are listening or watching, this is a one tenant problem or this is a one subscription problem? Like in terms of how stealthy I am, or can I use that to go completely? The blast radius could be the entire subscription.
So it really depends on kind of the context of the organization and also the level of access that you've managed to, let's say if you are a malicious kind of threat actor, the level of access that you do gain to these various environments. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of organizations that are spread across multiple Entra tenants that then each have like multiple to hundreds kind of subscriptions within each. So realistically, the access and kind of blast radius there really depends on specifically the initial access vector that you've managed to compromise.
Right.
The Stealthy API approach absolutely will encompass whatever access like the person that you've managed to compromise will have. So that access could vary from one subscription in one tenant to 3 tenants and then several hundreds of subscriptions. It really just depends on level of segregation done on like controlling who has what access and not like giving it overtly to like people having significant access over a lot and a large scope of resources, which unfortunately is still very much a thing. So it is likely that you might end up in a situation like that. In terms of preventing it, it's a very good question because there isn't a simple way of preventing the core issue, in the sense that it's a fundamental limitation with some of these APIs, so like the Ibiza API, that there isn't a way to log the read events. So
Yeah,
you can't
yeah.
really prevent that. But like we discussed a bit earlier, it's a focus on kind of the state changing stuff, and kind of flagging on that is the immediate thought from my end on like how to go about trying to still make sure that we can react quickly if some suspicious events are happening in the tenant. Obviously, the lack of kind of telemetry for reconnaissance is definitely a gap, and it's definitely difficult, and I appreciate like it does make it a harder job for blue teams and just security personnel to be able to like super quickly react and stop somebody from before they can even like touch anything within the tenant.
Yeah.
But it is the reality of the situation, so it is important for us to try and work with what we've got and then just continue on waiting for Microsoft to expand and try and cover these gaps. The other stuff that can be proactively done to minimize it is, for example, very stronger conditional access policies. That very much is a big control regardless of whether it is stealthy or not, because if there are strong controls to prevent you from logging into a user's account in a kind of an insecure manner. So, for example, let's say a common conditional access policy that a lot of enterprises have is allow listed IP ranges, which does make it significantly harder because then an attacker has to compromise an endpoint that either exists within those IP ranges or fully compromise, let's say, an employee device that has a VPN that can get them to those IP ranges to be able to log in.
Yeah.
Like ultimately, the more we kind of force attackers to have to maintain persistent access, as well as try and further compromise like devices that are managed, let's say, by and then have an EDR installed. That does increase the likelihood of their activities to be detected. Like ultimately, it's not necessarily about whether we're going to catch them in one go, but it's about forcing them to have to do as much as possible to maintain and persist within the environment, which then would increase the chances of somebody detecting, oh, this seems a bit weird because this has been going on for a couple of days and it seems a bit anomalous. So let me go and investigate this a bit more and wait, this might be an actual intrusion. Like that's the main focus area, I think.
Right. And conditional access policies definitely sound like the right path. Is there, I'm trying to think from a prevention perspective, that you know how a lot of people talk about, hey, if I have least privilege, let's just say, use that as a word. Because global admin, if you have the permission, you probably have it across the board. So because I think for context for people who don't understand it, it's like what used to be domain admin on-premise, global admin is the equivalent in Azure land. And you can still go back and forth between on-premise as well as the Azure portal kind of land as well. In terms of the lay of the land, because I imagine a lot of people coming maybe from an AWS background or GCP background, they will be listening and watching this going, okay, I guess this can be stealthy. This is probably bad, harder to detect. What do you say are fundamental things you recommend people to have in their Azure footprint, for lack of a better word, where across subscription, across tenancy, conditional access sounds like a great one to start with. Is there any other things that you recommend which kind of, to what you said, it's a prevention for, maybe this is just one of the things, but it can prevent a lot more. So it's like for example, in AWS, people might say, hey, make sure CloudTrail is on, guard duty is on, all of that, the good stuff is on. What's the equivalent in the Azure land?
Okay. No, that's a very good question. Absolutely. I think the final defense is definitely your conditional access policies because they fundamentally underpin all your login mechanisms to both kind of user accounts, but also you can even include like service principals, so like machine account logins as well, because it's a fairly recent addition and it does require a bit of an extra license, but you can restrict, for example, service principals, which have been historically a bit of an increased kind of interest to attackers because they typically won't be included in conditional access policies because the initial focus was on users and restricting user access. And then obviously that left machine accounts as being the next kind of viable target for attackers because typically they won't necessarily be restricted by kind of these conditional access policies. So as long as you manage to compromise a high privilege service principal, you can go wild from anywhere, regardless of whether or not the users are typically required to, for example, only log in via virtual desktop that's obviously locked down and everything else. Conditional access policies, core one, making sure that all your logs are being actually, first of all, generated.
Turned on,
sent somewhere. That's definitely a very good one. But overall, kind of other ones, like a very important one, but unfortunately it's also the hardest one for larger enterprises to implement, is exactly that kind of concept of restricting privileges down as much as possible. Like it's very much a difficult process because if you're a large enterprise, you typically have a lot of different teams that have to work, a lot of different silos within that business. And so access usually You either have a central team that's technically supposed to manage access across all these other teams and then dealing with all the requests around it, figuring out a minimum viable role is
Yeah.
usually a very hard thing to do.
Yeah.
And so you often end up falling back to roles that work and allow the people to do their work. And
Yep.
so ultimately accept the risk with it of saying, it's not ideal, but we'll get to it at some point.
But I trust Ashish. He would not do anything wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's definitely a level of, obviously, it's perfectly fine to trust your employees, consider your risk model for like insider threats and whatever. But it's a fundamental thing of how a lot of businesses operate. And that's also why it's still very much a problem even in 2025, where you often end up in situations where you're reviewing an environment and you're like, does everybody in this team really need kind of editor access or like contributor access in Azure, kind of editor in GCP or AWS equivalent? One step down from
Admin.
administrator.
Yeah.
Like, oh no, you often come into these and then there's usually, but that team needs it. Does it really though?
Yeah, and I think, because I was about to say, is there a service in Azure that allows you to almost not do user behavior, but go into the history of saying, hey, what was Christian up to? Oh, actually, because this is pointless because there's no read action. It's only change of state action that's being recorded for Christian.
So there is a service, I believe. It was a solution that was bought and then rolled out into Entra that works in the sense that it analyzes the types of permissions that you have used over a certain period of time and then suggests a lower...
Seems like you haven't been using admin for a while. Yeah.
And it provides you a more custom kind of permissions base. Was it entitlement manager? I just can't remember that. Primarily because I believe, unfortunately, I've not really seen a lot of adaptation of that. And I assume it's probably because of price points.
Oh, wow. Also, it's one of those license things.
Yes, it does come under a separate license. And from memory, or at least to my poor bank account, it does like a fairly expensive license suite. But there are some services that can do that. But obviously, mileage will vary.
Fair.
To that. In terms of other stuff within Azure, I can't really think of any good one other than that. Realistically, within
but that's a good one because I think the way I saw it is, okay, if people are being stealthy, you may not be able to detect it real time for now, but at least you are able to go back and see if you had the capability for it. Someone's threat hunting and they have those kind of logs to see, okay, what was someone up to over a period of, 6 months or 1 month or whatever. They probably could use something like permission management to go, okay, so it seems like
they can definitely use it to, for example, flag any sort of excessive permissions that you seem to have that you're not really using.
Yeah.
In terms of trying to detect these more kind of stealthy API usage, then you're still going to fall back a lot to sign-in logs, how people are actually using those entities and figuring out some anomalous factors there in terms of differences. It says that they've signed in usually from a Mac endpoint, but there's this one time that they signed in from a Windows user agent or something.
Right, okay.
Admittedly, obviously, it really depends on the skill set of the threat actor in terms of how sneaky and how stealthy they can be. Probably across that whole range of things that they might flag them.
That's right.
But in the end, there are definitely different logs. And then obviously the state changing stuff that does allow you to still get a grasp on activities happening in your tenant. So as much as it sounds really bad, it's not as bad as it sounds. Like, obviously, it will be really good if Microsoft continues trying to cover these gaps. They are definitely trying that. For example, the Azure AD graph that I mentioned earlier, which was the graph before Microsoft Graph, is going to be deprecated in the middle of this year, finally, after a long period of deprecation. So that's really positive news, because that does mean that a very common well-known method of just enumerating and getting information about the tenant is going to disappear. So people are going to fall back to trying to find more novel stuff. So like, for example, the Ibiza API, for example, might be the next focus for kind of tool development, etc., as it's one thing that does have that gap, which means that in the future, I am hopeful that means Microsoft will start mitigating, either moving away from, for example, to maybe Ibiza V2 that does have an ability to send the logs to Microsoft Graph, or something like that. Like, I can very much see it as a potential, because I think Microsoft does realize it is a problem. It's not that they're probably like intentionally not doing it. It's probably just limitations under the hood of how quickly they can change everything before stuff breaks. And so it's just a long process, I think.
Fair. And would you, maybe I would say, a positive note is a good way to have the tail end of our conversation as well. That was most technical questions I had. I've got 3 fun questions for you as well. Okay. First one being, what do you spend most time on when you're not trying to find these stealthy ways of being in Azure?
Oh, primarily play video games. It's going to be a very stereotypical answer. So I do enjoy finding all sorts of new stuff to play with groups of friends or just kind of solo from RPG standpoint. Other than that, probably D&D
nice.
On the side. That's pretty fun.
Do you guys dress up as well?
Not really. On Halloween.
Oh, Halloween, okay.
I do have one major hope for Halloween that I end up taking out every year or so.
Oh, fair.
But no, it's really good. I definitely think that this sort of, like the roleplay aspect I, for example, really enjoy, just because it gets you like thinking from different perspectives. I do think it, as much as this might sound a bit kind of shoehorned, it does make you like appreciate a bit more of getting into different perspectives. That is helpful even within kind of a more technical kind of cybersecurity.
Yeah, you can bring that back.
Absolutely, yeah. I think just the ability to be able to empathize and figure out, okay, they've made these decisions to get to this stage. It's not necessarily always due to somebody misunderstanding how stuff works or etc. There could be very well like legitimate reasons that kind of led to certain decisions being made. So it's not always a case of somebody did something stupid.
Yeah.
It's often cases of just that's the best that we ended up doing under the circumstances that we were at. And so I think that does help you out a bit to get to that viewpoint.
Fair. And what is something that you're proud of that is not on your social media?
I'd say I'm proud of just being able to help people in the industry because, for example, a lot of the work of like making a lot of these like lesser known APIs a bit more public and just in general being able to share this knowledge with the broader kind of cloud security community. A lot of it does fundamentally come from a desire to just get people to know a bit more about it and just help out people to be aware of it. Because it's not that all of this is, I don't think that this is incredibly novel because I suspect that some people or like even I suspect maybe threat actors are aware of some of these things, but it's important that we as a community just share a lot of this information openly with each other to figure out, okay, there are some limitations here, but what can we do about it? How can we end up fixing it? So I guess that's from a personal perspective. I'm always really glad to see research that actually helps either other people with their work or it spawns some other research off the back of it. That's the sort of thing that like makes me, I think, as a personal achievement of seeing that you've actually managed to help other people. Like realistically, like you managed to help the community get better and overall make everybody safer in a certain sense.
Yeah, no, that's a good mission to have as well. Final question, what's your favorite cuisine or restaurant that you can share with us?
Oh, now this is a good one. There is this personal favorite restaurant is this really small restaurant on the way to Bansko in Bulgaria. Okay. It's a really small kind of family diner / restaurant, like incredibly small, but they make the best chicken fillets ever. Oh, bang.
Chicken fillets?
Absolutely.
Is chicken fillet a thing in Bulgaria?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow. The best chicken fillet?
Absolutely, best chicken fillet. 100%.
Oh, wow. Would you remember the name of the place?
Oh, no, I don't think it even has a name. Like it's legitimately
it's like for people who
family kind of restaurant sort of thing, but it's incredible.
I need to find this. So is it like on a highway somewhere?
Yeah, it's on the highway basically on the road to Bansko, but it's a very kind of niche answer. If anybody does manage to find it, I will be well amazed.
Oh, wow. Okay, well.
It is incredibly good. But overall, I mean, from a cuisine perspective, I'm very much, apart from some vegetables that I'm not really a big fan of. Like, I'm fully open to everything. For example, Asian cuisine, Japanese cuisine, I really like. Ramen, banging, best thing ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's, I guess,
Wait, so if you were stuck in an island somewhere, you probably would have that chicken fillet every day?
Oh, if possible, yeah. That would be awesome.
No, that was all the questions I had, and I think I need to... It's always in a challenge for people to find out where is this place. Like you did give enough hint. It's on the road to, what was the place?
To Bansko.
To Bansko.
Is like one of the biggest ski resorts in Bulgaria.
Oh my God, so it's on the way to a ski resort as well.
Yeah.
When else do you need a chicken fillet?
It's before the big Pirin golf course.
Oh,
I've given enough hints. I think people can eventually find it. There are a bunch of restaurants in kind of one after the other, because usually there's a pit stop for people to stop by and eat something on the way. So people can find it, and do definitely visit it. It's super and cheap.
It's cheap as well. I think the OS in a challenge for people who may be interested is, where can people find you on the internet to talk a lot more about the work you've been doing with Azure?
Yeah, absolutely. No, hit me up on whatever. Like, I'm on Twitter/X, I'm on Blue Sky, LinkedIn, whatever floats everybody's boat.
I will leave those links over there as well. But dude, thanks so much for coming in, man.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Great conversation. Now, fun was for me as well. Now I need to put up my OS in it challenge to find out where this place is. But hope everyone enjoyed the conversation. Talk to you soon. Thank you so much for listening and watching this episode of Cloud Security Podcast. If you've been enjoying content like this, you can find more episodes like these on www.cloudsecuritypodcast.tv. We are also publishing these episodes on social media as well, so you can definitely find these episodes there. Oh, by the way, just in case there was interest in learning about AI cybersecurity, we also have a sister podcast called AI Cybersecurity Podcast, which may be of interest as well. I'll leave the links in the description for you to check them out. And also for our weekly newsletter, where we do in-depth analysis of different topics within cloud security, ranging from identity, endpoint, all the way up to what is the CNAP or whatever a new acronym that comes out tomorrow. Thank you so much for supporting, listening, and watching. I'll see you next time.